Okay, we've been looking at this cold calling problem from the 30,000 foot view, and then 20,000 feet, and then around 5,000 feet. Now it's time to bring it in for a landing. So let's get into the details. Okay, I admit that this can be a bit intimidating, and it may seem like a lot to do on a simple cold call, but you knew we were going to have to go over it a few times so you can get used to the approach. But if you think about any good conversation, one where in essence you have to convince someone, say a friend, to do someone, how, other than by force, is it possible for you to persuade someone to do something important, perhaps something they don't necessarily want to do, like an intervention when you have a friend with a drug problem that you want them to take care of, unless you get them to confirm that they're the right person to be talking to, get them to acknowledge that they have a gap between where they are and where they want to be, get them to see the impacts of that problem on their situation, get them to see how it affects other people, get them to see the cost of the problem for themselves and other people, get them to see how, if they do nothing about it and time continues to pass, costs will add up, get them to see how, on the other hand, if they did something about it, their life would be better, get them to see how, if they did something about it, other people's lives would be better too, get them to describe their conditions for doing something about it, get them to share their concerns about doing something about it, get them to confirm that they want to do something about it, and get them to take a small step towards doing something about it, both as a show of agreement and to move the process forward. Ask yourself, is there any other way to convince someone to do something if they don't otherwise want to do it? Clearly, there is no other way. We'll give you a flow chart in a moment to help you guide you through the process because it's obviously a little complicated. But if you hear an echo of counseling for dummies here, you shouldn't be surprised. This approach comes right out of the coach's handbook. Of course, since we're talking about business, asking these particular questions is functionally designed to draw out the specific costs and benefits with which to populate a business case, one that justifies a meeting or even a sale, which we talked about before. But like it or not, persuasion is all about asking good questions. So if you've come this far, it's time to screw on your thinking cap. There are two important sales aids that you're going to need in order to make your calls. One is the call flow diagram and the other is the cold call worksheet. If you haven't printed them out yet, now's the time to do it. As you can see, the call flow diagram actually has many canned questions already written in. We can do this because, while it may not be a surprise, many of the questions you'll need are actually pretty standard. That is, it doesn't matter what you're selling, the questions that you need to ask in order to uncover needs and justify the meeting are often the same. The only thing that actually changes is the function or area that you're asking about. And since you don't really want to be talking about your product or features, much of the call can actually be pre-scripted, and customizing a question that asks the prospect about our goals and challenges with respect to X only requires that you substitute one phrase or sometimes just a word. In any event, we've also left space for you to write in your own specialized questions and to fill in some of the blanks that make it appropriate for your own offerings. As we said before, and as you can now see, getting someone to want to meet with you can nevertheless take quite a few steps. And while there are some shortcuts that you'll eventually be able to use, if you don't understand and practice this core process, then you won't have anything to fall back on if you get off track. So let's roll up our sleeves. Let's assume that you've stimulated the prospect's initial interest with a good IBS in your opening. That means that you share, at least for a moment, a mutual objective of seeing if there's a fit between her needs and what you can do, and a reason to talk for a few minutes and maybe longer. To see if there's a fit and a reason to meet, you use the question types shown on the call flow diagram in roughly the order they appear. As you get more proficient, you'll probably want to be more flexible with the order of the questions, and you may even get clever in how you ask them. But for now, we're going to go through them in order, but a bit deeper this time with a focus specifically on how to build that business case for meeting. For each question type in this section, we're going to explain what the question type is and how it works. We're going to give you an example or two. We're going to give you some helpful hints on how to use it. We're going to show you how to record the prospect's answers on your cold call worksheet, and we're going to explain how the prospect's answers contribute to the business case for meeting, because that's the whole point of the exercise. For this section, let's assume that we're on the phone with a VP of sales of a mid-sized tech firm and we're selling cold calling training. You can plug in your equivalent questions and answers as we go along if you'd like, but hopefully you'll see how to create your own questions from these examples. As you can see, you start the questioning phase of the call, or the body of the call as we said before, by asking permission to ask questions, with a question such as, would it be okay if I asked you a couple of questions? Or, before I go into detail about what we do, would it be okay if I asked you a couple of questions? Another version that can be used later in the call, for example, if the prospect is about to terminate the call because you didn't build enough value and therefore can't close, is, before we go, would it be okay if I asked you one quick question? Or, before we go, would it be okay if I asked you one last question? If you want to set up a prospect for an objection rebuttal, you can ask, I'm not sure I understand what you mean, so could I ask you a couple of quick questions? As you can see, permission questions don't only have to be in the beginning of the call, and this also hopefully further illustrates the point that a lot of questions can be pretty standardized. Basically, permission questions set the prospect up to answer your other questions, making it a little easier for you to ask them and for the prospect to answer them. Obviously, they can also give the prospect an excuse not to answer them, but even this is okay because probing for the reasons why they don't want to answer can enable you to uncover a need, perhaps one that's so important that it even prevents them from answering your questions. For example, if the prospect refuses to answer your questions right up front, it's usually indicative of a weak IBS, in which case you need to give them a better one, or at least strengthen it before you make your next call. Or if they refuse to answer your questions later, it's usually because they don't see the value in answering them. But in general, permission questions enable you to gain control of the call or regain it if you've lost it. Because remember, he who asks the questions controls the call, right? So keep yourself in a position to control the call by using an occasional permission question. Here you can see an example of asking a permission question right after you deliver your IBS and your purpose of the call. So let's read along, starting with our IBS, which says, we provide cold calling training that can enable you to double your appointment rate, triple your close rate, and shorten your sales cycle by half. The reason for my call today is to tell you a little bit about what we do, find out a little bit about what your needs might be in this area, and see if there's a fit and a reason to talk further. Before I go into detail about what we do, though, would it be okay if I asked you a couple of questions? To which the prospect says, sure, go ahead. So why do they agree to answer our questions? Assumedly, it's because our IBS was so compelling, interesting, and relevant, but it could also be because they went to customer school. To be sure, if the prospect refuses to give you permission to ask questions at this point, it's usually either because your IBS was too weak or because you failed to establish rapport, so you may have to go back and debug. Nevertheless, you can easily turn it around. For example, if they say, no, just tell me about your product, a good response would then be to repeat one or two other IBSs and then to ask a new question. They'll usually answer it, and you're back into the call, such as in the sequence on this next slide. Here we ask our permission question, which is, before I go into detail about our solutions, would it be okay if I asked you a couple of questions? But for whatever reason, maybe because she wants to control the call, maybe because she's too busy to think about it, or maybe we just didn't hit her nerve with our IBS, and she refuses to let us probe, saying something like, no, just tell me what you have and I'll ask the questions. Obviously, we need to regain control of the call, but we don't want to get into an argument with her, and neither do we want to answer her questions because we know that since we haven't uncovered any needs or associated any value with our solution, she's not going to grant the appointment if we just tell her about what we're selling. So instead, we give her what she's asking for. Sort of. That is, we don't tell her what we have other than to repeat the fact that we provide cold calling training, and we may add a benefit to it. But instead, we immediately give her another, hopefully stronger IBS. And while it doesn't answer her question in the sense of telling her exactly what you have, it certainly addresses its intent by telling her what she'll get out of it. And so it gets the call back on track, as in this example. Okay, well, as I said, we provide cold calling training that can improve sales performance by 200% or more while increasing cash flow, unit sales, and profitability. In fact, with our approach, clients actually find that they get higher prices for their products, reduced marketing expenses, and can more easily unhook competition. We then skip the permission question and go right into, could you tell me, is unhooking competition something that's occasionally important to your company? Of course, any qualified decision maker would find it hard to refuse to answer that kind of question. After all, refusing to acknowledge that unhooking competition is important would be a very bad thing for her peers to think about a VP of sales. And so she answers it, and in most cases, you'll be able to go on asking the rest of your questions. Notably, particularly for those of you who might view this as somehow intellectually dishonest, the fact is that in a sense, we really are answering her question. This is because, as we discussed, what we have to sell is not our products or services. It's the benefits that our products and services can deliver. In any event, if she still refuses to answer your questions at this point, or maybe with one or two more attempts, we would recommend bailing out of the call. She is evidently not interested in what you have to say or how you can help, because you can't formulate how you can help if you don't know her problems, and so she's therefore not likely to buy, in which case she's not worth your time. There are only a couple of helpful hints we can give you for asking permission questions. One is that if at the end of your purpose of the call you can swing right into your first substantive question, feel free to skip asking a permission question. In fact, you may find that sometimes you can even skip your purpose of the call and ask your first substantive question right after your IBS if the prospect will let you get away with it. It depends on how strong your IBS is and how much rapport you've built. Asking a permission question is like good manners. They are the standard and they can help, but you can get away without them in some circles. By the same token, they're also, like good manners, a lifeline when you get in trouble or lose control of the call. There's no direct contribution to the business case from a permission question, but getting permission to ask questions tells you that you're about to start receiving information, so you now need to prepare to take notes. So let's take out a worksheet and get ready to start writing. Looking ahead a little, here you can see an example of a completed worksheet. As you can see, it contains lots of very useful needs and other information from a sales perspective. So now we're going to show you how to dig out this kind of information on your cold calls. Now, it may surprise you, but just as we said that the prospect's time is often worth more than their money, so is yours. That is, you should not waste your time trying to sell an appointment to someone who can't buy your product, or at least help you get an appointment with someone who can. And so the earlier you can figure out whether or not they're qualified and ditch the call if they're not, the better. That's why when the prospect at the end of the last example wouldn't let us ask our questions, we bailed out of the call. After all, if she's not going to let you uncover needs or associate value with your solution, how can you possibly convince her to meet? Do you think she's going to meet with you just because you made her aware of your product's availability? While this may seem like a silly question because of everything we've said before about how important it is to show how your solutions can be financially justified, it's really a silly question because if she'd be willing to meet with you simply on the basis of her becoming aware of your product's availability, what does anybody need you for? You can be replaced with a line card. The only reason you're needed to make calls is because there's no other way to engage with the prospect in a dialogue that uncovers her needs and demonstrates the value of your solution to her organization, short of some elaborate but very inefficient online conversation that you can't get her to participate in anyway. So now let's take a look at a question type, one that you want to use very early in the call that not only enables you to determine if she's worth talking to, but where to probe for needs, the qualification question. After the prospect gives you permission to ask questions, either implicitly or explicitly, and you're free to probe, you generally need to ask qualifying questions next. This is initially to assure yourself that you're not wasting time and energy trying to persuade someone to meet who isn't a good fit, or at least to assure yourself that you're not spending time with someone who can't provide you with good information. But it's also done to help you identify areas to probe for needs. For example, if you were selling accounting services to small businesses and the only person you wanted to talk to was the owner, asking the person who answered the phone if they were the owner would be a logical qualifying question. If their answer was no, you could ask if they could connect you to the owner. But otherwise, there's probably no point talking to anyone else. On the other hand, if you are selling a solution such as software development, consulting, training, or equipment that has a broader constituency, you might be willing to talk to an operations manager, the owner, a CFO, or even someone in marketing who might be able to tell you that their current approach wasn't working very well. Notably, you might actually not want to talk to the manager who owns the process right away if you think he or she might be threatened, but when you become proficient with this technique, she clearly would make a good contact. Regardless, if under your strategy trying to get an appointment with someone who isn't appropriate is a waste of time, then terminating the call earlier rather than later is a good idea, which is another reason we ask qualifying questions. You should keep in mind that there are many circumstances where it might very well be worthwhile to try to uncover needs from someone who is not the owner or decision maker before you talk to the owner or decision maker, so gathering information before disconnecting can be a great strategy. But it's your choice as to what to do with the dial. Just don't waste it doing a show and tell for someone who can't help. Going back to the example where we're selling cold calling training, asking qualifying questions such as, Are you involved in decisions regarding investments in new marketing strategies? Is profitability one of the things you're responsible for? Are you involved in the productivity and performance of your sales team? Are you responsible for your company's marketing programs? All make excellent questions that can help qualify the prospect as being worth trying to talk to or meet with while starting to identify some needs. And it should be an easy matter for you to come up with similar questions for your company's offerings. Asking, to what degree are you responsible for understanding the bottom line impacts of your major sales and marketing initiatives? In what ways do you get involved in making decisions about your training programs are also good types of questions. If they deny involvement, and you can try a couple of other angles, but if there's no relationship to your area of interest, say by no more than 1 or 2 degrees of Kevin Bacon, move on. Even though they seem innocuous, qualifying questions are among the most powerful questions there are. This is because a good qualifying question can help you determine if the prospect is worth talking to, while they can simultaneously start to identify needs. For example, to what degree are you responsible for reducing waste in your marketing program is an example of a leading question that forces the prospect to accept responsibility for something bad, because to do otherwise would be impolitic. Admitting that they are responsible qualifies them as worth talking to, at the same time as it also draws them into a discussion of needs. Some cold callers may feel uncomfortable asking these types of questions, the when did you stop pulling the wings off of flies types of questions. However, they end up leaving a lot of money on the table as a result. But to not ask these types of questions and adequately qualify your prospect can make a cold calling campaign extremely inefficient. In regard to efficiency, qualifying the prospect early in the call so that you don't demo your solution to someone who can't buy or can't help is an excellent way to minimize waste in a program. This is because explaining features and benefits or giving demos or webinars to prospects who have no need, or worse, no real influence over the decision, is a common activity that looks productive on the surface, but in actuality wastes both clock and calendar time, as well as money and expectations of success. Even worse, of course, is sending a sales rep out on a call to meet with a prospect who's not qualified to buy. Not only does it waste the $100 or more in field sales expense, it incurs the opportunity cost associated with the rep not being able to do something more productive with his or her time. This creates resentment and anger and can quickly cause you to lose your job. In short, you don't necessarily have to ask the prospect to fill out an application to be probed for needs, but you should be clever enough with your qualification questions so as to not waste your time and energy on someone who can't at least help. Here's an example where we ask someone who turns out to be the VP of Sales, to what degree are you involved in decisions regarding training in areas like cold calling? And the prospect responds with, I have overall responsibility for generating sales at the company, and our people do get involved in cold calling, although most of our reps don't like to do it. We also have 2 people in the marketing department who work the phones occasionally, but any sales training that we do has to be relevant for our industry, and it has to be able to demonstrate that it can improve sales results and ROI, because it mostly comes out of my budget. As you can see, the response to our qualification question, the prospect has identified several issues of interest to us, even though she's evidently not the only decision maker. First is that she weighs ROI when making any decision, so we're probably going to have to come up with a financial justification for the training. Her people don't like cold calling, so there may be some resistance there. And there are 2 people in marketing who get involved, so we're probably going to have to talk to their boss too. We may have a problem with our relevance to her industry because our cold calling course is deliberately generic, although it can be customized for a price. But we're clearly going to have to show how it can improve her sales results and ROI if we're going to get in. So being able to show how we can bend the curve is going to be important. She's also telling us that we may have a budget issue, as she has to fund the training at least partly. This means that we may have to persuade her to not do something else, something that they were planning to do with the money, in order to get in the door, which can be a big hurdle for a cold call. Clearly, her responses point to some of her needs, like improving sales results, achieving an ROI, and getting her people to make more calls. It also points to needs in another department, since if they're doing cold calling in the marketing department, there must be a need there too, and so we probably have to talk to the marketing manager as well. But the key issue is that she has a goal for generating sales and sales results, and that's the thing we need to target primarily with our questions. If we can get her to see how the cold calling training can help her better achieve her sales goals, we should have a good chance at getting in the door. And we got all of that out of asking a simple qualification question. As far as helpful hints are concerned, notice our preference here for open-ended questions, by the way. In other words, we ask our questions in the form of, to what degree are you involved in, rather than, are you involved in? Open-ended questions like these get the prospect to talk and to elaborate, which is one of our goals. Closed-ended questions, which can be answered with a simple yes or no, tend to stifle the conversation. For example, if we had asked, are you involved in making decisions about sales training, she would have said yes, and that would have been all the information we would have gotten out of her. By asking, to what degree are you involved in making decisions about sales training, we got her to open up and provide us with a wealth of information. As you can see, qualification questions can make a significant contribution to building your business case for meeting, which you can start to populate using your cold calling worksheet. In this case, we know she has sales goals, she has a performance metric for ROI, and she has a budget within which she probably has to keep her expenses. We also know that there's a marketing manager out there somewhere who probably has a deliverable for lead generation. Otherwise, they wouldn't be putting two people on the phones. We also heard that she has people, probably sales reps, who get involved in cold calling. So we have to assume, for the moment at least, that they have a bogey for new business, if not for appointments specifically. But let's put the appointment need in as a placeholder for now, just so we don't forget it. Clearly, we don't know anything about what these things are costing them yet, or what their objectives are, or if there's much of a gap between where they are and where they want to be, other than her comment about wanting her reps to do cold calling, and evidently they don't like to do it. So we have a ways to go. But this is a good, and I hope you'll see as a realistic start. Oh, we can also put in something about industry relevance, ROI, and impact on sales results in the decision criteria space, but we should expect it to change as we uncover more information. In any event, you shouldn't worry if you don't get this much information out of a simple qualification question. We wanted to illustrate an example of a good one and pick it to death for a minute, but there are many other and many better ways to get more and better information on a call. So we're actually going to deliberately forget some of this information that we just gathered and proceed with the call as if we weren't so lucky or so smart. As you can see, asking a qualifying question, particularly an open-ended one, can easily identify areas to probe. It can identify other stakeholders who you may want to talk to, and it can even begin to identify the decision process and the decision criteria. And it can do all this while helping you determine if you ought to stick with the call or bail out and call someone else. We're now ready to move on to pain questions, the real meat, if you will, of the call flow. Once you've determined that the prospect has some involvement in the decision or use of the product, you then need to ask pain questions in order to uncover needs, pains, problems, challenges, concerns, dissatisfactions, issues, and unmet goals of the prospect with which your product or service can potentially help. This is so you can begin to identify gaps between where they are and where they want to be with respect to the area, so you can later position your solution as a way to close that gap. Given that you've identified an area of interest, like sales or information flow or production, for example, with your IBS and your qualifying question, the standard pain question, which we recommend be the first one you ask after a qualifying question, is, what are some of your goals or challenges with respect to sales, or whatever the equivalent application domain is for you or your product and service. Now, for sure, you could ask, what are some of your challenges with respect to maximizing the ROI of your marketing programs? Or how are you doing with respect to maximizing the comprehension of your content? Or how are you doing with regard to being able to get the most out of your limited production resources? And these are all good pain questions. But the simple formulation, what are some of your goals and challenges with respect to whatever, assuming you created some interest and credibility with your IBS, is one we found works very well. It is clearly designed to get the prospect to open up about their challenges, which is what you want them to talk about, but it also leaves them an out by allowing them to talk about their goals instead if they want. Either path can lead to a discussion of problems and gaps, but whatever pain question you use, it should at least be open-ended so you can get them to open up. In other words, don't ask, are high error rates a problem for you? Or is the fact that your employees aren't reading your training material a concern? Or do you have a problem with long lead time on production? The reason you don't want to ask closed-ended questions is because, first, by being able to be answered with a yes or no, the prospect can answer it and then leave you with nowhere to go. But more important is the problem that asking closed-ended questions here means you have to guess what the prospect's problems are. And by your third guess, we can assure that the prospect is going to get bored with the conversation and hang up on you. In any event, the rationale for asking paying questions, as we said earlier, is that everyone in business has goals and everyone has challenges in meeting those goals. Otherwise, they wouldn't be getting paid. So a basic paying question like, how are you doing with respect to meeting the goals by which you're being measured? Or to what degree is there a gap between where you are and where you want to be in this area? Are, if you can be specific about the area, extremely powerful in their ability to get the prospect to open up. Clearly, if you haven't built rapport and credibility with your opening, then you may not be able to ask such an intimate question. But if you did, and especially if you gave an IBS that's compelling and relevant, such as a question would be entirely appropriate. In fact, asking it clearly illustrates that one of the main reasons you're in business and why you offer the products and services that you offer is to help your customers achieve their goals. So why not ask about them? Obviously, the prospect could be doing well with respect to meeting their goals, so they might say that everything is fine. But note that everyone also has what are called stretch objectives, against which far fewer of them will be doing well. And so if the prospect says they're meeting their sales goals, for example, you can then ask if they have a stretch objective. And if they say yes, you can ask how they're doing against that, which most people will not be meeting. Either way, you will have identified a gap between where they are and where they want to be, and you're on your way. And that's the point of a pain question, to identify a gap between where they are and where they want to be. Now, for sure, we may not yet know what the metric is or how wide the gap is, but we know we want to find a gap, and so asking about it is the surest way to identify it. Once they acknowledge that they have a gap between where they are and where they want to be on some performance goal or some area that they're responsible for, then you're going to want to quantify their problems. So let's look ahead for a moment and then come back to pain questions. That is, you're always going to want to get the prospect to put some kind of number on their gaps to quantify the problem at some point in the conversation. This could be a dollar figure, such as where they have a sales goal of, say, $10 million, but they only sold 8. In which case they missed their sales goal by 20%, or it could be a quality metric, such as where they want at least 90% of their output to be good, but their yield was only 50%, or it could be a percentage ROI where they wanted to get a 10-to-1 return on their IT investment, but they only got 2-to-1, or maybe even a negative return. It could be in the area of expenses, such as where they targeted a salary expense to be, say, $500,000, but because of bad hiring, it came in at $600,000, or it could be a problem with the return rate, their CSR turnover rate, or the average sales size, or even the duration of their development cycle, all of which can easily be expressed numerically. We'll talk in a moment about asking cost questions to get them to reveal these numbers, but anticipating that you're going to need to quantify the gaps helps highlight the need to identify those areas where there is a gap between where they are and where they want to be. And to do that, you ask pain questions like these on the next slide. For example, as the Vice President of Sales for the company, could you tell me some of the performance metrics for your marketing and sales programs that you typically look at? To which she says, I have metrics for revenues versus forecast, marketing ROI, sales expenses, and profitability. So you respond with another pain question like, how is the company doing with respect to, for example, hitting its revenue targets? To which she responds, year to date, we're not actually doing that well. We're projected to come in at about 80% of the goal for the year, although our margins are good. So you probe into the problem a little deeper with, do you have any idea why sales are underrunning the forecast? To which she replies, the marketing people tell me that demand is down, but my salespeople tell me that marketing just isn't getting the message out. So you ask another pain question like, to what degree is that a problem for you? To which she replies, it's a huge problem. So maybe you have a little fun with this. So you ask, which would you say is more likely to be the right answer, if either? Which she views as empathetic and answers, they're probably both true to some degree, but not knowing is also a big problem. Can you see how asking about gaps between where they are and where they want to be, particularly in functions for which they are responsible, and particularly on metrics for which they are being measured, is an excellent way to uncover needs, pains, problems, and unmet goals? The question for you, of course, is, can you actually have a conversation like this? Of course you can, Assuming you've established some rapport and credibility with your opening, you can easily ask questions that get the prospect to talk about what she's measured on and how she's doing with respect to those metrics. And as a result, you can easily identify areas where you can help. You can see a couple of examples of pain questions on the call flow diagram, but it's really your ability to identify the areas to probe for needs and challenges that opens up the range of possibilities. Specifically, if you think back about the case histories you wrote up and the needs you identified and the applications you defined, each of these substitute for the area in the standard version of the pain question. For us, for example, we could ask, what are some of your goals and challenges with respect to covering your debt service? Or what are some of your goals and challenges with respect to making sure your salespeople have enough leads to go after? Or what are some of your goals and challenges with respect to getting the prices you need to get? Or unhooking competition? Or sales force productivity? Or lead quality? Or close rate? Hopefully you can now see why we had you write out all those case histories, needs, and application descriptions, because now you can go right back to them and identify all sorts of areas you can probe. You can't identify areas you can help with out of thin air, but you can do it by referring back to your case histories. As you can see, by the way, this is another reason why product training is misguided. While you might be able to infer areas you can help with from the product training, they're sitting right in front of you now because of what you did in creating the prerequisites for this course. So as far as helpful hints are concerned, we can now add these. Keep in mind that everyone who works has a job to do and that virtually everyone who gets paid gets a performance appraisal of some sort. Therefore, the things that you're looking for will often actually be on their performance appraisal or on someone somewhere. So you could easily ask what they're measured on and how they're doing with respect to the goals on their performance plan. You can also legitimately ask questions about how other people are measured and how they're performing, assuming that the prospect to whom you're talking has a reasonable stake in their performance. We'll get more into this issue when we ask about who cares questions and quantifying their impact when we ask cost questions. But first we need to look at how pain questions contribute to the business case for meeting. As you can see from our cold call worksheet, we've started to identify a number of other issues and needs that represent gaps between where the prospect is and where she wants to be. For example, she told us that year to date we're not actually doing that well. We're projected to come in at about 80% of the goal for the year, although our margins are good. She also told us that marketing reports that demand is down and that sales thinks marketing isn't doing a good job of getting the word out. We've highlighted the new information in yellow, but you can see how, if you ask these types of questions, you can quickly fill up a worksheet and need extra paper to write your needs on. You can also see that you can start pulling numbers onto some of these problems, such as sales running at 80% of quota. Other factors will still be qualitative, such as a report that margins are good, but demand is down and promotion is weak. You're going to add more lines to the table and populate more cells as you ask more questions, but you should now be getting a sense of where this is all going. For example, if you now see that her sales are at 80% at some point in the call, you're going to ask her, assuming you can impact it, what would it mean to her if she could get her sales to 100% of quota or even beyond? That's for later. For now, you should start thinking about the impact that something like this might have on the company's P&L and on the business case for meeting. Before we get there, though, once the prospect has identified a few problems or gaps between where they are and where they want to be, you should ask so what questions in order to start to magnify the problems and find additional problems you can talk about. So what questions do this by getting the prospect to tell you the consequences and downstream impacts of the problems, that is, the ones you've already identified, principally on her own situation and on her immediate interests. For example, you could ask, if you can't get revenue on track, what does that mean for your ability to make your profitability targets? Or, if demand is in fact down, what impact will that have on your ability to reach your revenue goals? Or, if marketing can't get the word out and generate more qualified leads, what does that do to your marketing ROI? Or, if your salespeople can't close more business, what impact does that have on the overall financial condition of the company? Or, if the company doesn't make its forecast, how does that impact you personally? So what questions enable you to show the impact of the problems on the prospect and on areas of interest to the prospect personally. They start to show the consequences of the problems and magnify those impacts so you can make them seem more important to the prospect and therefore more actionable. Later, when you start to put costs on these impacts with cost questions, you can add them to the cost justification for the meeting. But think of so what questions as a game of for want of a nail, where a small problem leads to a bigger problem, which leads to a bigger problem, which leads to a bigger problem, until everything is on the verge of falling apart. Another way to think of it is like a child who keeps asking why, except in this case you keep asking so what. It can get annoying, so you don't want to go too far, but it's a powerful tool for making a small problem look big. From the technical perspective of the business case, so what questions identify additional lines on the P&L you can impact so you can probe for those costs and add them to the business case next. For example, if you can't resolve who's right, marketing or sales, what do you do to get back on track? Or if marketing can't find a way to stimulate demand, even if it is down, what's going to happen to your plans for growth? So what questions, in a sense, force you to listen to the prospect. They therefore enhance empathy and rapport because they focus you on the prospect and her needs, not on your product and your needs. And that's a good thing. Remember, when we're talking about listening skills, this is what we're talking about. In any event, here's a brief excerpt from a call where we're asking some so what questions. Such as, you ask, if there's a demand issue, how does that impact your role as the VP of sales? And the prospect responds, well, for one thing, I have a bogey to hit, within the plan year at least, and it's immutable. And no one cares if I missed it because of external factors like demand or internal issues like the performance of my team. So you ask, so if you can't hit your targets for revenue and profitability, what happens? So she says, I might get another year to fix it, but eventually I'll lose my job. Now, clearly this is a big consequence and a big so what, one that you could sympathize with or explore further. So you could ask more about what else happens if she misses her targets or what she is doing to fix the problem too. But instead, let's see if we can find some consequences for her organization if they're not making their numbers by asking, what about the performance of your sales team? To what degree are they responsible for finding new business regardless of demand? To which she responds, this is really my biggest challenge. Our people have to find new business regardless of what's available or we're not going to make our numbers. So we ask a so what question about that and what happens to them if they can't do that. And so she responds with some more pain and consequence, such as with, I'll either have to find a way to improve their performance or I'll have to find new people. As you can see, you can run this out for quite a while, and while most people have the perception that a cold call ought to be short, you can see from this example that an in-depth conversation is not only going to result in an appointment, and a better one at that, but it's more likely to result in a sale eventually. This is because, especially if you ask a bunch of so what questions, you're going to uncover lots more problems that you can solve, and therefore identify a lot more value that your solution can deliver. As a result, when it comes time to weigh whether to grant you an appointment or not, what do you think is going to happen? All of these problems that you uncovered are going to press down on the side of granting the appointment, and when we finish driving home the point with costs and who cares and urgency factors, as well as what's in it for you and benefits for other people, it's going to be a slam dunk. But first, let's finish talking about so what questions. Once you get started, so what questions are easy to ask. Good ones include, really? Is that so? Tell me more. But your goal is to get them talking. So ask your questions and stand back because they get the prospect to talk. They can also buy you time while you think about where you want to go with your next questions. But the big benefit of asking them is that they get the prospect to tell you all sorts of consequences of their needs and problems, of the gaps between where they are and where they want to be that you identified earlier. So if you ask a prospect what some of her goals and challenges are, say with respect to system development, and she says, well, developers are expensive and there are always more requests than we have resources, you can ask if that's a problem for her, to which she's likely to say yes. So you can then start asking so what questions like, what impact does the cost of a developer have on your ability to fulfill demand for systems? And how does the pressure to bring new systems and enhancements online impact your ability to maintain older systems? And if you can't keep up with demand for systems, so what? If you can't control the cost of developers, why is that a problem? If you can't fulfill requests for new systems, what impact does that have on you and your organization, and how are they problems? Again, as you can see, it's a lot like the poem For Want of a Nail, or in some cases, it's a little bit like chasing Alice down the rabbit hole. Whatever metaphor you want to use, grab these needs by the neck and wring whatever consequences you can out of them. They can only help make your case for the appointment. At the risk of piling on or making the notes illegible, we'll just add one or two of these consequences as needs to our worksheet. But you should add them all. The more consequences of the problems that you can identify, the better, because each of these are themselves problems, as you can see. Because in a couple of minutes, you're going to ask the prospect to add costs to them. So write them down. Hopefully you can see that you're gathering a lot of good information with which you can justify an appointment using these kinds of questions, and you're not even halfway done with the call. But you should be able to see that if you keep going, you're going to get the appointment, and it's going to be a good one. Of course, one of the problems that many salespeople, and many cold callers in particular, have with asking so what questions is that they've heard it all before. This means that when they ask a so what question, they've probably heard the same answer 100 times before. For example, let's say you're selling your marketing services and you ask a question of a sales VP such as, if you don't make your revenue objective, what happens? How many times do you have to hear, well, for one thing, I won't get a bonus. I may have to lay people off and I might even get fired depending on how badly I miss it before you find yourself saying it in your sleep. As a result, many cold callers don't ask the question, and that's a problem. First, you should realize that the purpose of you asking the question is not in the hope of hearing a new and different answer. You're asking it because of the impact that answering it has on the prospect. It makes her recognize, acknowledge, and maybe come to terms with the issue, and that in turn leads her to actually want to do something about it. Another problem is that when you hear the same answer 50 times, many cold callers feel that they can show the prospect how smart they are by telling the prospect about the impact instead of asking her about it. And as a result, they think then that the prospect will want to meet with them because they're so smart. But that's not how the buyer sees it. She may in fact think you're smart, but she's not going to meet with you just because she thinks you're smart. She's going to meet with you because you made her admit her problems and want to do something about them. And if you tell her what they are, then that stops the process in its tracks. So sit back, ask the questions, and enjoy listening to the answers, even if you've heard them 50 times before, and take notes, of course. Even though we're only talking about generating an appointment here, putting subtle and sometimes not so subtle pressure on the prospect to meet with you by getting her to recognize, one, that meeting with you will put her in a favorable position with her peers, and two, that not meeting with you will put her in an unfavorable position with her peers, is an important part of the cold calling process. Since we are by nature social animals and we care what our peers think of us, who cares questions can go a long way towards securing an appointment. To be sure, looking beyond an initial meeting, who cares questions are powerful tools because they bring other people into the scope of the problem. Their needs not only contribute to the business case for meeting, when it comes time to vote to buy a solution, having as many people on board as possible is essential, but you need to leverage the influence of other people if you want to generate leads efficiently. In brief, asking who cares questions help you to identify who else is impacted by the problems that the prospect has already identified. Of course, this tells you who else you have to talk to, so make a note of it. But equally important for current purposes, it helps identify more needs that can further contribute to the motivation to meet. For example, you could ask, who else is affected by the inability of marketing to generate enough qualified leads besides the sales team? Or, who else is impacted by the revenue problem? Or, if you can't find more demand, who will that affect and how? Or, if you can't resolve some of the uncertainty with respect to sales and new business, who does that affect? In general, the more people whom you can identify as being affected by the problems, the better. This gives you more people to talk to and to sell to, and therefore more justification for the meeting. Who cares questions are pretty straightforward, as you can see, since they are simply trying to map out the players who were affected by the problems. But they are extremely fraught. First of all, most cold callers are trained to focus on the decision maker and on getting the appointment with them. The problem is, though, that very few decisions in business are ever made just by one person. Most decisions are collaborative, so co-opting other people is a virtual necessity for most sales. And if that's the case, then anticipating the need to co-opt other people is both a logical and strategic move in lead generation. Just ask the salesperson for whom you're generating the lead. Even more important is the fact that it's simply a lot easier for someone to refuse to meet with you if they don't think there will be any repercussions, either from their boss or their peers. On the other hand, if you bring those people into the picture by asking who's affected by the problem, it's very hard for a prospect to shut you down. At the very least, she's going to worry that now that you know what their problems are and who her peers are, she runs the risk of you meeting with them about it and maybe even solving it with them and being the hero before she meets with you. How powerful a motivator is that? Another way to think of it is this. Most cold callers would be able to generate an appointment on the vast majority of their calls if, on the vast majority of the calls, the prospect's boss had told the prospect to meet with them. All Who Cares questions do is put that influence in your hands. How cool is that? So, for example, you could ask, if you can't increase revenue production, whose budget is going to suffer? If you can't get a better return on your marketing programs, which product managers are most affected? If your sales reps can't get more appointments, who's going to have to pick up the slack in marketing? If you can't hit your profitability target and your stock price goes down, who would be affected by that? Now, we certainly don't want you to come away from this discussion thinking that we want you to be completely mercenary about this. A little bit's okay. Instead, look at Who Cares questions as a way to show and feel genuine empathy. Asking who's affected by a problem is often the humane thing to do. And of course, since your role as a vendor is to help your customers, getting to know the people and their needs is directly linked to your success and theirs. But to not take advantage of the leverage that Who Cares questions gives you will cause you to miss many opportunities that you could easily have otherwise gotten. In any event, we can now illustrate this part of the conversation. As you can see, asking Who Cares questions opens the floodgates to information, needs, and new potential contacts. For example, if you ask, so as far as revenue shortfall is concerned, who does that impact? She might respond with, well, it certainly affects the salespeople, but it also affects every other employee in the company, as no one gets a raise if we don't make our numbers. So you ask, how about in terms of unit sales? Who does that impact? So she says, the biggest people who get hurt there are the production people. If they aren't able to run it at or near capacity, they're going to have to lay off workers. So you ask, is anyone else affected, say, by the inability of the marketing program to uncover more demand? So she responds, well, certainly the salespeople are directly affected, but if we can't get a good ROI out of our marketing, you have to kind of increase their budget rather than decrease. As a result, everyone else is going to have less to spend. So you ask, I see. Could you tell me who else is involved in addressing these issues? And so she says, currently everyone is working on it. Our CEO is primary, our VP of sales, our director of marketing, and even our plant manager is on it. We're all trying to come up with ways to keep the doors open. As you can see, not only did this uncover all sorts of people who care and give you more people to talk to about more needs and problems, but it seems as though you stumbled into a major initiative at the executive level to address it. Now, you certainly don't want to just bust right in and ask if you can meet with everybody. There's plenty of time for that, and it's probably better left to the sales rep. And she's probably just going to tell you that it's none of your business anyway. But knowing that all these people have a hand in the solution, if not the problem, is a great piece of information to gather and to pass along to the rep. And so it clearly points to more factors that weigh in on the side of meeting. As you can see, it's actually very easy to ask these questions. You don't have to be a financial genius or a marketing expert or a plant engineer. You just have to know how to ask good questions and the information will flow. As you've probably observed, it's very hard to get people to give you names, but asking Who Cares questions, that is, asking who's impacted by the particular set of problems you're talking about, makes telling you who the players are a positive thing for the prospect. This is because if they bring you in and you solve a problem for them, they'll look like a hero. Asking who Cares questions also puts you on the same side of the table as the prospect in addressing the problem. Instead of it being you versus them question, it becomes a we versus it issue. The impact on the business case should be obvious by now. Who Cares questions let you fill in more stakeholders on your worksheet, more issues, and soon more costs. We're not going to add more here because the worksheet will just get too crowded and we actually already jumped the gun identifying many of the players already. But when you make your calls, make sure you identify all the major stakeholders in the problems you identify. By the way, a great technique when they answer your questions about who's affected by a problem is to mumble under your breath, I'll have to remember to call them. If a prospect is on the fence about meeting with you, they'll respect you more because they'll understand that your talking to other stakeholders is an appropriate part of your assessing their needs and seeing if and how you can help. And of course, they'll be more likely to want to meet with you themselves so you don't make someone else the hero instead of them. It also makes it very easy for you to get other names to call. Unlike the case where if you ask a receptionist who is responsible for such and such, they never tell you. But if you ask the prospect who is responsible for, say, new product development right after they just told you that new product development was going to be eliminated if they don't turn things around, they're much more likely to tell you. First, they're going to do it because they know that you already know it's an issue, and you're obviously not going to ignore it. But more importantly, if you can actually help, then the prospect is going to look like a hero to the new product development manager if she brings you in. We'll talk later about how to get names out of a receptionist, as it's closely related to this technique. But we'll have to cover some other things first, such as putting a number on these needs and problems. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of putting a dollar value on the problems, we need to explain a little bit about the sequencing of the questions. That is, it isn't necessary to first identify all the problems and then to identify all the consequences and then identify all the people who care and then to quantify the cost of each problem for each person. You could identify one problem and then identify its consequences, then identify who's affected by it, and then put the costs on it, and then you can go back and do the same with the next problem and the next. It doesn't matter. It's whatever you feel comfortable with, as long as you gather the data with which to build the business case for meeting. In fact, in practice, you may even qualify a prospect more than once on the call, first against the job title and then later against responsibility, for example. We're going to go over it in this order because it works better for learning it, but you can scribble all over the chart in whatever order you want, as long as you cover all the steps and build a compelling enough business case for the meeting. So now let's put a whole bunch of nails in the coffin by getting the prospect to tell us how much their current strategy, the one that's not working as well as it should, is costing them. That is, let's get them to associate costs with the problem they mentioned that they had. In order to do that, you need to ask cost questions so they can tell you how much each problem or consequence is costing them. This helps you build a strong and realistic business case in their mind for moving forward with a meeting at this point on the potential for your solution to reduce many of those costs and problems. As you can guess, the more costs that you can get the prospect to associate with their current approach, the better your alternative, or at least meeting to talk about it, will look in comparison. For example, if you could add $2 million in sales in return for a 15-minute meeting, that would make it seem worthwhile. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, we only need to get them to see that the possibility of improving things is worth more than the cost of the meeting. Looking at it this way, though, you can see the issue that this raises. That is, despite what you say or imply, they may put a low probability on the chance that a meeting with you will reveal a profitable solution, and they may put a high price on their time. But that just says you may need to identify a lot of costs and opportunities and maybe offer to bring some additional value to the meeting. But as you can see, the former is now easy to do, and the latter is now easier to do as well. Here's a little spreadsheet to illustrate their thought process, which occurs instantaneously in the prospect's mind. Remember the "why should I care" question? This is how it works in real time and how you win the game. As you can see, if they perceive that there are a lot of needs and costs that could be reduced or revenue that could be gained, they're more likely to want to meet. If not, they won't. For example, in the Uncover Many Needs column, after talking with you on the phone and uncovering lots of needs, they come to see the problem is costing them $2 million a year, and they think there's at least a 5% probability that meeting with you will result in a solution. So they make a quick and admittedly informal calculation that the expected value of the meeting is $100,000. On the other hand, if you uncover only a few needs worth only a few dollars, they might think that the problem is costing them only $10,000 a year, and even at that, they conclude that the probability of you being able to help is only 1%, so they do the multiplication in their head and come up with a $100 value for the meeting. Assuming that they value their time at the same under each scenario, say at $500 an hour, it's clear that meeting with you after you've uncovered a lot of needs has a very positive net value, while meeting with you where you've neglected to uncover needs has a very low value. In fact, it could be negative. Do you see why you need to uncover lots of needs and problems and put a dollar value on them too? And do you see why, as far as maximizing the perceived probability that the meeting will result in a successfully implemented solution is concerned, this is primarily a matter of credibility? And what demonstrates your credibility on a cold call? Not product knowledge, that's for sure. What best demonstrates your credibility on a call is your ability to ask good questions, understand their needs, and help them see the value of meeting as a step towards a solution. Where we want to go with this now is to fill in as many of the cost boxes as we can with as much cost and other tangible impacts as we can get the prospect to admit with our cost questions. For example, if you can get the prospect to tell you that their ROI on invested capital is less than 5%, but their shareholders need it to be over 20%, that's a huge cost and a huge problem. If you can get her to tell you that competition is driving the benchmark price in the market down to $10,000, but they need to get $11,000 to break even, you've identified a problem. If you can get the prospect to tell you that the response rate on their email marketing program is 0.01%, but they need it to be 1%, they're off by 2 orders of magnitude and they have an enormous gap to close. If you can get her to tell you that they're currently getting 10 new appointments a week, but they need 50 in order to fill their funnel, that's another cost you can target, and so on down the line. To be sure, not every cost is going to be in dollars. Some are going to be in other units, and some are going to be coefficients instead of results. But the more metrics you can put on the problems, the easier it will be to quantify your value. And when your expected value exceeds the expected cost of the meeting by enough, you'll get the appointment. So now, to get at the cost of the problems, you can ask questions like these based on the problems you've just been discussing. By how much do you think demand is down overall? What market share were you getting before the problems hit, and what market share do you think you're getting now? How much revenue do you think your competitors are stealing from you right now? How much lower do you think price has been driven? What's your current response rate to your email marketing program, and what do you need it to be? What does it cost you to replace a sales rep who resigns? How much have you invested in marketing recently, and what kind of ROI have you gotten on it? As you can see, for every need or problem you uncovered, you should try to get the prospect to assign a cost, and then write it down on your spider chart or your worksheet. If you do, you should now see your business case for meeting to start to take shape. You can hear this happen, of course, in the dialogue, which might go something like this. You ask, by how much do you think demand is down overall in the market? To which she says, we really don't know. The marketing staff says it's down 20%, but even if they're only half right, it's still $1 million hit to our top line. So you ask, that sounds like a lot. What does that translate to in terms of a hit on your profit margin? So she responds, if we were running at capacity, our margins might be 20%, but where are we now? It's wiped out our margins almost completely. So you ask, in terms of current business, how many customers do you think you've lost in the last year? So she responds, the last time we looked, it was probably around 30. If this keeps up, we're going to have to restructure pretty soon. So you say, wow, I'd like to think we can help with that. But before we get into how, can you share with me what turnover looks like? And she responds, well, if we lose a salesperson with a $100,000 base, it's around 20% to replace them, plus 6 months for them before they're productive. So not counting the lost customer and the lost opportunity, it's around $70,000 out the door. Does this sound like a reasonable conversation, especially in light of what transpired previously? If you're getting into it with a prospect like this, you've built credibility and rapport, and if you've held out the possibility that you might be able to help, why wouldn't she share her problems with you at this level of detail? And why wouldn't she share a perspective on costs? The dirty little secret of this is actually about what she's doing to you rather than what you're doing to her. Specifically, by telling you all this information, she's effectively setting the benchmarks by which your performance is going to be measured if you end up doing business together. For example, if you're proposing that your solution can enable her to replace those 30 customers or eliminate turnover, she's going to hold you to it. So it's actually in her best interest to tell you what you have to fix, how bad the problems are, and how you're going to be measured. Ask yourself, is this a realistic conversation to have on a cold call? Set aside how long it might take. Could you ask these kinds of questions? If you're like most people, the answer is yes, once you knew that it was okay to ask them. Would it be worthwhile? Most people find that not only is it easier to get appointments this way, but the subsequent face-to-face calls are better too, and the salesperson who makes the call would be so well armed that it's almost impossible to not get the sale. So what about the time it might take? Ask yourself, would you rather have one 20-minute conversation like this and get the appointment, or would you rather have 21-minute conversations where you don't? Keep in mind, of course, that not every cost ultimately has to be expressed in terms of dollars, but coefficients, those things that determine the shape of the curve, can be in any units. It could be in response rate, productivity, returns, appointment rate, complaints, days, price, percent increase, ROI, time to market, or any of 1,000 other things. Some can be binary, like passing or failing a performance review, and some can be human impacts, like job losses or turnover. Obviously, most impacts and costs can be converted to dollars, which is often a worthwhile part of the process. But when generating a lead, you can often get away with the raw representation of a cost. In fact, it's often more dramatic to do so if it's not in dollars. As you saw, there's space right on the worksheet where you can put the costs that you uncover. If you want to build something more elaborate, fine. But remember, you're on the phone, you're in the heat of battle, and so a spreadsheet isn't a good option. Rather, if you can jot down a few compelling numbers, you'll do great, and you'll generate lots of great appointments. We understand that this may seem like a lot of work, but what you're likely to find is that this is actually the easiest way to generate an appointment there is. Just ask a bunch of good questions like these, get her to tell you the costs that she's incurring, that she's unhappy with, and the prospect will simply convince herself that she wants to meet, even if it's only based on the possibility that you might be able to help. In fact, here's a way to see how much more efficient this is than what you normally do. If you typically make a call and stimulate a little interest, what does the prospect typically tell you to do? Send me something, right? So you send her something and call her back a week later. When you call her back, she tells you that she's read it and she's not interested, or she hasn't had time to read it, in which case you wait again. Now, which is more efficient? One of the biggest problems that appointment setters, cold callers, salespeople, and business development specialists face is getting the prospect to agree to a specific date and time for a meeting and actually show up rather than putting it off. Getting them to commit to a date requires that you create urgency, which you do by asking urgency questions. Once you've identified some of the costs associated with their needs and problems, you should ask urgency questions so you can make the prospect want to meet sooner rather than later. These questions ask how the costs grow over time, especially if the prospect doesn't do anything to solve them. The reason urgency questions work is because time is always passing, so costs that accumulate over time always get bigger. And that creates urgency, because if you don't stop them from growing, at some point they'll put you out of business. A simple example illustrates the concept. If you ask, if you're losing 10 customers a month, how many customers will you have lost after 2 months? So she says, 20 customers. And so you ask, and after 3 months? And so she says, 30 customers. So you ask, and after 4 months? And she says, 40 customers. So you ask, considering the lead time for implementing a solution and the value of a lost customer, at what point does this become something that you need to do something about? Urgency questions like these, which get the prospect to see how the cost of doing nothing adds up over time, are the best way to accelerate the lead generation process and close out a lead. This is because no matter what else happens, time will always pass. And so if there's a cost that is time dependent and it helps justify your solution, you should point out to the prospect not only the static cost, but how it grows over time by asking urgency questions. Given how simple this technique is, you might be concerned that a prospect might say to you something like, I know how to add. What do you think, that I'm stupid? But in 30 years of using this technique, we've never heard that response. Not once. The closest anyone has ever come to calling us out on it is when someone says, I get it. You don't have to beat me over the head with it. And then they grant the appointment. In using this technique, you can ask how any cost accumulates that is subject to a time element. Here are some other formats you can use. The $80,000 you pay in insurance, is that every year? How many customers do you typically lose in a year due to bad finished product? What is the net present value of having to pay 8% extra on your corporate loan each year instead of 4%? If you waste 75% of your marketing budget each month, how much will that add up to by the end of the year? Again, you need not be a financial wizard to ask urgency questions. In fact, playing dumb is actually your best strategy, not only when asking urgency questions, but when asking any question. Asking about the impact of time on a cost is perfectly logical. Just remember, nobody cares what you know. They only care about their own needs and problems. After a while, you'll get in the habit of accumulating every cost the prospect tells you. For example, if they say that they have to pay $15,000 to refurbish a machine, ask how often they have to do it. That makes it another urgency question. If they tell you that they get 25,000 bounced emails back per month, ask how many that is each quarter. Along those lines, another tool for constructing urgency questions and creating urgency is to ask about any deadlines the prospect might have that would be jeopardized by inaction. For example, if you don't have a solution in place before the new order comes in, how are you going to fulfill it profitably? If you can't get your new product on the market by the time the RFP comes out, when is the next time you're going to get a shot at the business? This can create urgency, provided you ask it in the form of a question, of course. Just remember that all needs are always in some state of satisfaction, so they may have a contingency plan in place for important events and blown deadlines. By the same token, they probably don't have a contingency plan for a confluence of multiple unrelated events. So if you can position your product as the solution to multiple time-critical problems, the combination is highly likely to trigger action where any one blown deadline might not. When you're keeping notes, most urgency questions will cause you to simply annotate a previously written cost with per year, per month, per quarter, or per week as appropriate. But sometimes that will also make a very small cost become very large. For example, if the prospect has to recalibrate the machine and it costs $1,000, it might not be a problem. But if they have to do it every day, it can be a big problem. Most important is that if you identify an urgency factor that's big enough and critical enough, note it in the bottom section of the worksheet. Confirm that it's a critical path item to the prospect, and you'll have a great tool for accelerating the meeting and the close. An interesting aspect of urgency questions is that if you get stuck in the lead generation cycle and you can't get the prospect to commit to an appointment date, you can always ask an urgency question. For example, when we spoke last time, you had mentioned that you recently lost a sales rep because of a customer service problem. Can I ask, how often does that happen? Or, when we last spoke, you had mentioned that your growth rate in sales was declining by around 10% per month. If I can ask, at what point does that become a problem? Or, when we last spoke, you had indicated that your sales were behind quota by 20% for the year to date. What happens if that hasn't been fixed by the end of the year? This alerts the prospect to the fact that they knew about the problem and they didn't do anything about it yet, and that it's going to happen again. Knowing, by the way, that you may be talking to other people, remember the, I'm going to have to talk to them about that, they will recognize this as a veiled, albeit benign, threat and generally go ahead with the appointment. And it was such an innocent question. With all this talk about needs, pains, problems, and unmet goals, and with all our discussion of consequences of these problems for the prospect, her peers, her customers, and her company, consequences that have costs and costs that accumulate over time, and with all the risk that other people will find out that the prospect could have done something about it, that the problems, but they didn't, that you created, it can all get pretty depressing. And while it's both fun and clearly productive to wallow in the misery for a while, it's not a great way to build a relationship. Relationships are built on hope, so we have to find a way to make the glass look half full instead of half empty. We have to find the pony in the pile, which brings us to the question of what's in it for you. This is also, as you may have already observed in your calling, because getting people to do something almost always involves some self-interest on their part. That is, rarely do prospects act to rid themselves of a negative, but they will often act aggressively to gain a positive. And so we need to focus on the positive consequences of considering your solution, starting with identifying the positive consequences for the prospect herself. Asking what's in it for you questions is designed to create a desire on the part of the prospect to move forward with the appointment by getting the prospect to tell you what benefits they themselves might get out of solving the problem. For example, you could ask, if you could get your customer losses down, what would that mean for you personally? If you brought in an effective new way to unhook your competition, how would that impact your position in the organization? Or, if you could increase your market share, what would that enable you to do that you couldn't do before? Or, if you could reduce waste in your sales program, how would that help you meet your individual KPIs? Or, if you could get the number of bad leads down by 80%, what would that mean for you? Or, if you could free up 10% more sales budget each month, how would that help your sales operation? Getting prospects to perceive that meeting with you will benefit them personally is the secret sauce of lead generation. This is because it refocuses the prospect away from her problems and onto how great life could be if she had a solution. This lets her imagination run wild with ideas about bigger and better things to come, and so it makes the prospect optimistic instead of pessimistic. And best of all, it causes her to associate you with good things instead of bad things. In a sense, what's in it for you questions are less like the reasons to meet that we talked about before, those needs and problems, consequences, and costs, which were like counterweights to the prospect's natural desire not to meet. Instead, what's in it for you questions are more like mitigators of the natural desire not to meet itself, deflating her personal objections and laziness. They're more like putting your hand under the right side of the scale and pulling it up than putting your thumb on the top of the left side of the scale and pushing it down. It's like lifting the prospect's internal resistance instead of trying to counter it. In fact, this is more than just a metaphor. Personal benefits, or what's in it for me's, are personal first. Then they're benefits. This is because asking the question, what's in it for you, causes the prospect to think about themselves first before they think about the benefit. They'll even often sit back in their chair and ponder the idea of how good life would be if their problems and barriers to success suddenly vanished, and they'll actually feel good before they even know why. Of course, when they answer the question, it will be with more reasons to move forward, some of which may not be so lofty, but it's a good image to keep in mind as you think up and ask what's in it for you questions, because they put both of you on a positive forward path. When documenting the answers to what's in it for you questions, you put benefits on the right side of your worksheet if you're using a worksheet, so you can focus on them independently of the problems. If you're using a spider chart, some people like to use circles for benefits as opposed to rectangles for problems. Either way, you want to get the prospect to tell you what she sees as the positive consequences of solving their problems for her and her organization. And of course, you want to follow these what's in it for you questions with questions that get her to quantify the gain too, if you can. The positive consequences go in the benefits column. The beneficiaries, whether her or someone in the organization, go in the beneficiaries column. And the quantification of the benefit, whether in dollars or in some other improved coefficient or a percentage improvement, goes in the value column. As you can infer, we generally don't define a separate question type for putting a dollar value on what's in it for you questions and benefits in the next section like we did when we were testing out costs, although we could. The reason is threefold. First, sometimes the dollar value over what's in it for you or a benefit is simply the negative of the cost. Second, a lot of times the prospect will anticipate the question and just tell you what the dollar value or delta is. And third, in cold calling as opposed to face-to-face calling, there often isn't time. And the fact is that you can often get a good appointment without putting a hard number on the benefit, because by that time she's already grabbed you by the lapels and demanded that you schedule the meeting. But if you can't get the appointment yet, then drive through to the finish as in this scenario. So let me ask you a question. If you could get 50% more appointments from your salespeople and lower your account losses by 25%, what would that mean for you personally? So the prospect says, well, it would mean I wouldn't have to ride my people so hard and I wouldn't have to sweat closing the quarter. So you ask, how about in terms of compensation and job performance? And she says, of course, I'm incentivized to hit my numbers, but assuming that the appointments were good and the business closed, I'd be a hero around here. So you ask, what if you could shorten your sales cycle? What would that enable you to do that you couldn't do before? And so she says, a shorter sales cycle would have a multiplier effect. That is, if it took less time to close sales, we could go out and make more sales, and as a result, our market share would go up even faster. Is this a realistic conversation for a cold call? One where you took your time and dug for needs a little? Of course it is, and it would make for a great appointment. Think of what's in it for you questions like having a drink with a friend who just won the lottery and you ask, what are you going to do with all the money? Have fun with them. Enjoy speculating about how great life is going to be. You're going to pile on some more benefits in a moment, but get ready to close on a great appointment. As for helpful hints, many people don't ask what's in it for you questions because they don't get to them. They think they've run out of time. But doesn't everyone have time and the right to celebrate, or at least anticipate the celebration before the hard work starts? What else do we strive for if not for the rewards? As they say, you catch a lot more flies with honey than with vinegar. The other hint is that asking what's in it for you questions are a good way to avoid falling into the trap of talking about your solution. That is, many people start talking about the product once they've identified a need, but this undersells your value. Lift up a little bit on the right side of the scale. Just don't push down that hard on the left. So as we said a moment ago, we don't only want to identify the benefit of the solution to the person to whom we're talking, we also want them to speculate as to what the benefits will be to other people and groups within and potentially beyond the company if we were to help remove their barriers to success. This draws their interests into the conversation, making it a lot harder, both politically and economically, for the prospect to refuse to meet. For example, if you were to ask a question like, if you were able to get 20% more sales using the same resources you have today, what would that mean for your operations department and their ability to make their numbers? How could she not care? How could she not speculate about the benefit? Isn't that a pressure she's under? Doesn't she hear complaints every day from the production department that they're going to have to idle workers if she doesn't get more sales? Knowing, of course, that you could just as easily call the operations manager and solicit his complaints about the sales, she has no choice but to tell you exactly what the benefit would be to him if she improved her performance. And so she does. But even looking at it from a much more positive view, and not as if you're pressuring her, doesn't her contemplating it all make her feel like you could help her be a hero? Of course it does. And since people will work a lot harder to achieve a reward than they will ever work to avoid pain, she's going to jump at the chance for you to help. And that's why benefit questions work so well. So here are a few more examples. If you were able to get a higher price in the market, what would that mean for your CFO? If you had a way to increase attendance at your company's seminars, what would that mean to your marketing department? If you could reduce rep turnover, what would that mean for your training budget? If you had a way to raise your prices and still close new business, what would that mean for your profitability and who would be impacted by it? If you could shorten your sales cycle and increase your win rate, what would that mean for the plant? And if you could reduce customer complaints, what would that mean for your customer service department? As you can see, getting the prospect to speculate about the benefits that would accrue to other people if they solved their problems further bolsters the justification for the appointment, often by quite a lot. Putting dollar values on each, of course, is merely icing on the cake, but getting the prospect to speculate about how a solution would help other people in the company is an extremely powerful motivator for a meeting. The way it would sound is something like the following. So if you were able to get twice as many appointments and they were to close at twice the rate you get now, what would that mean for, say, the production department? And so she says, they'd be thrilled. They've been on my back since December because we didn't make our numbers last year, and so they're running pretty far below capacity. If we could improve results, they wouldn't have to lay people off. So you ask, how about the marketing department? What would it mean for them? And she says, they'd take credit for it and probably get a raise. But all kidding aside, they'd probably be able to boost their budget, and we'd end up getting some better marketing programs, so it's a win-win. Is this realistic? Clearly, the best way to find out is to try it. But we think you'll find that if you do, you'll quickly learn what having them eating out of your hand really looks like. As you can see, asking these kinds of questions, benefit questions, drives an enormous amount of value into the meeting from the perspective of the prospect. This is because it brings other people's interests into the equation, and you're not just stuck trying to justify the meeting on the basis of what the prospect cares about. These questions, in fact, make it very hard for the prospect to ignore you. She can't hide and say that no one else is interested because you know that everyone has a customer, whether it's internal or external. It also helps set you up to successfully manage that collaborative decision process we talked about before. After all, if the VP of Operations thinks that if the sales department uses your products or services, he can avoid laying off some production staff, if the VP of Marketing thinks that if the sales department or whatever department you sell to uses your solution, they can improve their performance and get a budget increase, and if the product manager thinks that if the company buys your solution it would help, why wouldn't they vote for it? To not vote for it would be crazy. So not only does asking benefit questions help justify the appointment in the mind of the prospect, and not only do they give you more people to talk to, they set up the sale for a successful close. What could be better? Ultimately, people don't invest in solving problems as willingly as they invest for gaining a benefit, especially if it's for other people in the company. It's the old positive reinforcement theory. Remembering that we're talking about benefits here and not advantages, the more treats you can offer the prospect, the more she's going to press the button. So ask about them and add them to your worksheet. If you've gotten to this point in the call, you're probably thinking that you should just go for the close. After all, you've got her eating out of your hand, what with the perception that you're going to solve all these problems and make her look like a hero in the eyes of her peers. And you could easily ask, after building this much value, Okay, it sounds like getting together might be worthwhile, so which would be better for you, 10 a.m. on Tuesday or 2 p.m. on Wednesday? But remember that your goal is not only to get a good appointment, it's to get one that results in a sale. And so long as you still have the prospect on the phone and they're basically eating out of your hand, you might as well pick up a few more assets. So if you have a little more stamina and you really want to stick the landing, let's just ask a few more questions. If you think about the sales process that you're ultimately serving, two of the most important pieces of information that you can acquire when generating a lead regard the prospect's decision process and the prospect's decision criteria. This is because any salesperson who goes out on a set appointment would be thrilled if the decision process and the decision criteria for the sale were included in the write-up for the lead. That is, if you could report not only on what the prospect's needs are and what value the prospect would get from a successful implementation of your solution, but if you could also tell the salesperson what the decision process is for moving forward with the purchase and what the decision criteria would be, at least insofar as the prospect you're on the phone with is concerned, you would be a superstar. So the first question is it appropriate and possible to acquire it? Then, is it worthwhile? As far as the issue of whether it's possible or not is concerned, it should be obvious that it's not only possible, but that it's easy to do because it fits entirely within the context of the call. For example, how hard would it be to ask, could you tell me, what is the decision process for something like this? What's the prospect going to say, especially after all she's been through and in light of the fact that you're going to make her a hero? No? No, she's likely to map out the whole process for you with something like this. Well, it's pretty straightforward for any new training initiative. The functional manager, which would be me in this case, needs to see if it meets a need that we have. Then the director of HR looks at it, and if we agree that it has merit, then we, along with the vendor, put a proposal together and send it to the executive committee, of which I, the plant manager, and the owner are members. Is this useful information? Of course it is. And how long did it take to acquire it? By my watch, 16 seconds. Is it beyond the scope of the conversation? Of course not. In fact, it would seem illogical to the prospect if you didn't ask it. The prospect's answer, of course, suggests that the salesperson would be remiss not only to talk to the VP of Sales, especially if one were to consider all the stakeholders and needs you've identified so far. He at least ought to talk to the HR director and maybe even the plant manager, if not the owner, too. But the sales strategy is, of course, for another day. For solving the lead generation problem, identifying these players and the steps and identifying the other stakeholders identified on your worksheet is both more than adequate and immensely valuable. But it does bring up a couple of other important issues. First, when you ask, what is the decision process for something like this, you should understand that most prospects actually interpret that question as who is involved in the decision process. This is both good and important for two reasons. First, it is generally entirely inappropriate to ask, are you the decision maker for something like this? Just as it is equally inappropriate to ask, who is the decision maker for something like this? Setting aside the fact that both of these are closed-ended questions and therefore bad, the reason is that, as we said previously, most business decisions are collaborative. This means that multiple people are usually involved, and so if you try to focus it on one person with a closed-ended question, you force the prospect to lie or at least misrepresent the process. Second, this question illustrates the tremendous flaw in many of the cold calling techniques used today and many of the systems and management practices that support them. For example, most CRMs force you to define the primary decision maker on the opportunity record, which is entirely inappropriate for most complex selling situations. Many sales managers likewise berate their salespeople and cold callers to reach the decision maker, an often fatal practice in B2B that misses critical opportunities to influence the collaborative decision process of most prospects. A better system and approach would allow for multiple decision influencers with multiple criteria. Of course, none of this is intended to suggest that it's okay to get in the door with someone who has no influence whatsoever. That would be foolish under most circumstances. An exception would be with the agreement of the sales rep. But the right thing to do is to map out the decision process and the decision criteria, as we'll discuss in just a moment, and then work it. And that's what decision questions are designed to do, to identify the players and their roles so you can develop and implement an effective sales strategy. As far as digging out the decision criteria is concerned, it's equally easy. For example, you could ask, can you tell me, what criteria do you use for something like this? To which she might say something like, I usually go through the course, and if I like it, I recommend that we buy it for our people. So you then ask, how about for the HR manager? What typically does he look at when deciding if something is worth doing? So she says, well, he usually does his homework. He talks to other people who have taken the course, and he also sometimes goes through it. And how about the executive committee, you might ask? To which she might say, they typically look at expected ROI as well as funding issues, like if we have the cash to pay for it. As you can see, this information would be critical to any sales representative and is great information to have. And it is also not unrealistic to ask an executive to speculate on what criteria another executive might use. As you can see, there's space right on the form where you can put the information about the decision process you just gathered. And you can also add any new information that you got regarding the decision criteria. While usually thought of as a sales process issue, which we'll get to in a moment, asking decision questions like these enable you to understand the decision process for buying at a time when the prospect is actually most likely to tell you. It can also help you identify who else you may need to talk to, even if it's just to get an appointment, so you know who else to call. But setting an appointment where you're able to tell the salesperson that the decision process and criteria for the sale is always considered to be a premium appointment. So ask decision questions and write the process and criteria down on your worksheet. We're not quite done with all the question types, as you can see, but before we get to the last two, checkpoint questions and closing questions, we need to address a concern that many cold callers have at this point. What about objections? As you may recall from the prerequisites section, while most traditional approaches to cold calling teach you to write out a bunch of objections responses in preparation for handling objections at some point in the call, the LeadGen.com technique rejects the whole concept of an objection, and therefore we don't have anything called an objections handle or an objections response in this course. Instead, we've found that the typical objection, like the ones you put in your rebuttal list earlier, isn't something that needs to be handled at all. Rather, these statements are simply expressions by the prospect that they don't have enough information to be interested in moving forward with the conversation at the moment. And instead of needing a response, these are principally indications that your technique may need a little debugging and remediation. Here's an easy way to understand the process. If the prospect says, I'm not interested, immediately after you deliver your initial benefit statement, that is, in your opening, you've already learned that it means you need to strengthen your IBS and make it more relevant for the next call. Or if she gives you the opportunity, you can try to deliver another, better one to salvage the call. This is because, as you know, your IBS is supposed to stimulate initial interest by talking about the problems and benefits that are supposedly important to the prospect based on whatever limited information you have about them at the time. And if it doesn't stimulate initial interest, then you made a bad guess about what that would be, what would be important to them. Therefore, your IBS was too weak or irrelevant, and you simply need to strengthen it. So if you lose the interest of the prospect later in the call, why should the cause be any different? That is, if during the body of the call you're supposed to be building interest in meeting, in particular by getting the prospect to tell you about their needs and problems and the benefits they want to gain, and the prospect all of a sudden says something like, I'm not interested, then it's a pretty good indicator that you've not been doing that. You may not have explained the purpose of the call or gained permission to ask questions, but more likely it is that you probably have not uncovered any problems that she's interested in addressing, any consequences that she's interested in avoiding, or any costs, or how they add up over time, or you may not have uncovered any benefits, either for herself or for anyone else, that she's interested in gaining. In general, that's all any of these types of comments mean. They're not objections, they're a lack of understanding on the part of the prospect as to why the conversation should continue, caused simply by your not having asked the right questions. To be sure, there are some specific issues that one or another of these comments might highlight. For example, if the prospect says, what company are you with? It usually means you failed to clearly identify yourself and adequately establish credibility. If the prospect says, we don't have the budget, it usually means you neglected to quantify the value before you proposed the solution. If the prospect says, we already have a vendor, then you probably failed to adequately qualify the prospect. And if the prospect says, how did you get past my secretary? It usually means you failed to establish rapport, although sometimes it can be an expression of awe regarding your cold calling skill. But they are all indicators that your technique may need a little work. That said, it's rarely a fatal problem. First, no one is expected to be perfect. You may spend months, if not years, honing your technique. Second, if you view these responses as constructive criticism, then you can easily learn to turn them to your advantage right in the call. To enable you to visualize how to do this, it may be helpful to go back to the analogy where you were giving driving directions to someone over the phone. If you think of one of these objections as the driver saying, I'm lost, I'm running out of gas, I don't have time, or I have no idea why I'm even coming to your house, you can easily imagine that most of the time all you need to do is empathize, reestablish rapport and credibility, remind them of why they're coming, ask a couple of questions to get you both reoriented, and then pick up from where they got off track. And a cold call is no different, because even if it was their fault for not following directions, it's still your responsibility to get them to the destination. So, for example, if you're giving someone driving directions, you might ask, what road are you on? And they'll tell you, say, Route 45. So you might ask, can you tell what town you're in, or do you see a major crossroad? So they'll say, I think I'm in Mapletown, and I just crossed Barry Street. So you say, okay, no problem, you're not that far away. And then you ask, did you pass the Broadway Hotel yet? And so they say, I see it just ahead. So you say, okay, when you pass the Broadway Hotel, you'll see a sign for Harrison Street, make a right, and then you ask, do you see the sign? Do you see how this works? Why is guiding a prospect to the conclusion you want her to reach any different? To remediate a call in real time, just as with giving driving directions, when you hear an objection, you may need to reestablish rapport and credibility, regain the prospect's attention and interest, or even regain permission to ask questions. You may need to go back and re-qualify the prospect, re-uncover needs, or re-ask some so what questions, or some cost questions, or some urgency questions, some what's in it for me questions, or some benefit questions. Only after which can you move forward with the call. But this do-over approach should not come as a surprise. It's not different than if the driver from the previous slide went too far and you have to ask them to turn around and go back. And in fact, you may find yourself backtracking more than once in a call, even a good one. This is because you may have to go through all of the steps on every call to get the appointment. You certainly have to get the prospect's attention and stimulate initial interest. You certainly have to establish rapport and explain why you're calling. You certainly have to uncover needs and problems. You have to uncover the consequences of those problems. You have to find out who's affected by those problems. You have to identify the cost of those problems, and you have to create urgency in solving them. You then have to find out what benefits are of solving those problems, both to the prospects and to other people. And only then can you propose a solution, that is, a meeting. But if you missed any of these steps, then you may have to go back and do them over again because your business case for meeting may be incomplete. And so in this sense, hearing an objection is simply a signal that you missed a step. And so it's just like debugging. You have to go back and do the step over again. To go back, it turns out, is very easy. The basic format is to confirm your understanding of the prospect's issue, even sympathizing with them if necessary. For example, you might say, I understand your concern or issue or question, and I apologize. I may have jumped the gun a little or missed something or gotten my information wrong. Then prepare the prospect for your response with a permission question like, before I go though, or before we get into the reason for my call, or before you hang up though, would it be okay if I asked you just one question or a quick question or a couple of quick questions? Deliver another, hopefully better IBS like, as I mentioned, we provide marketing solutions that can enable you to increase your sales, penetrate new markets, unhook competition, and double the ROI of your marketing program while dramatically reducing your cost per lead, time to market, and sales expense. And then respond to the prospect's issue with either a qualifying question, such as, to what degree are you concerned with sales growth or profitability or market share? A pain question, such as, what are some of your goals and challenges with respect to marketing effectiveness, account retention, or time to market? A so what question, such as, if you can't reduce your cost per good lead, what impact does that have on profit margins? Or a who cares question, such as, who is impacted by poor quality sales leads? Or a cost question, such as, how much do you think you're paying each month to produce unqualified sales leads? Or an urgency question, such as, if you can't improve your win rate, how long before you start to lose salespeople? A what's in it for me question, such as, if you had a way to eliminate waste in your marketing program, what would that do for your organization? Or a benefit question, such as, if you had a solution to the problem of bad leads, what would that mean for your sales team? In other words, if you hear anything negative, simply apologize, regain permission to ask questions, and go backwards in the call flow and do right what you didn't do right the first time. So if we read this together, we have the cold caller opening with, good morning, my name is John with LeadGen.com. Like you, we belong to the Springfield Chamber of Commerce. How are you today? So the prospect says, fine, thanks, what can I do for you? Neglecting to deliver an IBS, the cold caller says, are you involved in making decisions about your training programs? So naturally the prospect says, sorry, I really don't have time right now. Recognizing his mistake, the cold caller says, I'm sorry, please allow me to introduce myself. We provide cold calling training that can enable you to penetrate new markets on competition and increase your win rate while reducing your cost per lead, your time to market, and your marketing waste by 50% or more. Could you tell me, are you involved in issues concerning your company's sales or marketing programs? So now, having heard something of value, the prospect says, of course, I'm the CEO. What's this all about? The cold caller then repeats another IBS, and they're off to the races with. As I said, we provide cold calling training that can get you in the door with qualified prospects and decision makers who need your company's products and services and who want to talk with you about how you can help faster and with less hassle and headache than any other method. The reason for my call today is to tell you a little bit about what we do, find out a little bit about what your needs might be in this area, and see if there's a fit and a reason to talk further. How familiar are you with some of the challenges your sales team is experiencing in hitting their sales targets? As you can see in this example, the caller gave a weak IBS, and so the prospect tried to end the call. Going into the rebuttal reboot process and recognizing that they blew the IBS, the caller recovered by apologizing and delivering another better IBS, after which they got right back into the call. In fact, they did it twice because there was so much to make up for. Note that this also illustrates another reason why you need to have multiple IBSs handy, which we talked about earlier. You can also use the same technique to get back on track later in the call, although getting off track is far less likely once you're into the call if you've been following the process we recommend. For example, let's say you get off track perfectly innocently like this, where you ask, to what degree are you involved in issues of lead quality and conversion rate? And he says, you really need to be talking to our marketing manager. I'm the CEO. Your natural response, which doesn't even count as a rebuttal response, could be, I understand. Before I go, though, if you had a solution that could increase your profitability by 20%, is that something that would be of interest to you? So he says, of course, I'm the CEO. So not wanting to waste the dial, you say, could you tell me what are some of your goals and challenges with respect to maximizing profitability? And he says, well, I'm very concerned that our sales are running 20% below forecast. And you've just uncovered a need. As you can see, one of the critical assumptions in using this technique is that you have good listening skills. And not listening carefully when the prospect tells you that they're the CEO, which suggests that they're concerned with financial issues, not marketing concerns, is a good way to get off track. Regardless of the error, backing up in the call, as illustrated here, provides an easy and effective way to get back on track. So here now is your cold call worksheet after you've cleaned up whatever questions the prospect has. And so you can now move on to checkpointing. That is, once you've uncovered and written down a number of problems as well as some consequences of those problems, other people who are affected by those problems, the cost of those problems, the urgency of solving those problems, the benefit to the prospect of solving those problems, and the benefit to other people of solving those problems, you should start summing up what you've covered so that you can move on towards the close. And that's one of the primary functions that checkpoint questions can serve. They enable you and the prospect to confirm that you're on the same page, literally in some cases, and moving in the same direction, with an appointment being the next step. If you're not, then it gives you a chance to retrack and plug in the pieces that you missed. To be clear, checkpoint questions can also be used in the middle of the call to confirm that you understood what the prospect told you. For example, you might say, if I understand you correctly, any investment in new training has to provide a payback of less than 1 year. Is that correct? This, as you'll recognize, is how you set up a traditional trial close, such as, if I were to show you a solution that got you a payback in a couple of weeks, would that be worth looking at? But by now you should recognize that you should not use trial closes. This is because it makes the appointment your idea instead of the prospect's, and it puts the two of you on opposite sides of the table rather than on the same side of the table, which is where you really want to be. Instead, using checkpointing questions simply to confirm information that you already have, and if you're missing something, to lead into whatever question you need to acquire the information. For example, you can do a checkpoint near the end of the call that sounds something like this. If I understand you correctly, your reps currently get around 2 new leads per week from marketing. Many of the leads they get aren't qualified, and the salespeople are up in arms about going out on unproductive calls. You're running 20% below forecast, account losses are double last year, and you're in danger of having to reduce capacity, which also means that you may not be able to make payroll, and therefore you may have to lay some people off. Is that correct? Because you're basically giving her back information that she just gave you, she confirms it with, yes, that's right. So you do one more checkpoint just to be sure there are no other issues hanging out there with, Is there anything else you would need in order to justify getting together with one of our account managers for a few minutes? So she says, no, if you could help us with that, we'd both be heroes. As you can see, checkpoint questions enable you to reinforce important points without sounding arrogant or telling the prospect what to think, even as they set up the close. Therefore, you should look at your worksheet, checkpoint the line items with the prospect, and see if it justifies a meeting. If not, you may have to do more digging, but if you followed the process all along, you should be in great shape. Notice that we also snuck in the closing question at the end. Hopefully you'll agree, notwithstanding that this person probably went to prospect school, that this segue is both natural and appropriate. So now let's talk about closing questions. The first thing to notice is that closing questions appear not in the close, which are the 3 blocks above the concrete step, but before the concrete step branch point. This is because you ask closing questions not in the close, but in the body of the call. Perhaps it's a problem with nomenclature, perhaps it's an historical artifact, whatever the reason, we're going to ask closing questions now before we decide that we can conclude the call. Okay, so what if you've done everything right? What if you've established rapport, stimulated initial interest, explained the purpose of the call, and gained permission to ask questions? What if you then uncover needs, consequences, costs, stakeholders, and urgency, and identified what's in it for me's and beneficiaries and benefits to both the prospect and our upstream suppliers and downstream customers? Certainly you can close, as we showed 2 slides ago. You can ask a forced choice close on a date, or assume that she's in agreement and close on a next step. But what if, in spite of all that, she isn't ready? Or what if she simply refuses to grant you an appointment at this point? As unlikely as it sounds, because of all the value you've built, there are definitely going to be issues that come up. Scheduling may be a problem, or geography, or even timing, despite the urgency you created. In that case, you should still try to get a commitment from the prospect to do something, even if it's not to meet yet. Otherwise, you can't say that the call was successful. It's just you doing something, not them, remember? So now, if you remember, way back when, you came up with a list of potential concrete steps that a prospect might typically take during the process of becoming a customer. This is the time to pull it out. If the prospect can't or won't set the appointment, you need to close on something else, a concrete step. You just need to get them to do something. Generally, as you finish checkpointing, you'll get a sense as to whether the appointment is going to happen or not. If it doesn't, then simply propose one of your concrete steps as an interim or alternative measure. In fact, even if she's going to grant the appointment, it's worth it to ask for a concrete step. If not to lock it in, then just to move the sales process forward a little bit faster. For example, let's say that at the end of this script extract that we looked at before, she says she can't make it. Let's say she says, unfortunately, I'm going to be out of town for the next 2 weeks. Certainly it sounds legitimate, and you still have this strong sense that she's committed to the process, but the fact is that a lead can easily go cold once she gets off the phone. Other priorities impinge, and all this value you've built becomes nothing but vaporware, because as soon as she hangs up the phone, the law of fast forgetting is going to set in. To prevent the problem, to maintain momentum, and as proof that you made progress, here's what you need to ask the process to do something. So when you go to close, she says, unfortunately, I'm going to be out of town for 2 weeks. So you simply say, that's okay. In the meantime, would it be possible for one of your sales reps to fill out our form regarding specific topics they'd like help with? By the time you get back, we can have it analyzed, and that way I can show you a more customized outline for the course. She agrees for a follow-up, and you've got your concrete step as a fallback to the next appointment. So while we're on this subject, let me ask you, is there any reason why you wouldn't ask her to do this even if she did grant the appointment? Concrete steps are a great way to cement her commitment and fix your value in her mind even if she hasn't yet granted you the appointment. This is because if she has a work item to do, then she's going to think about why she's doing it when she does it, and that's going to reinforce in her mind the value that you built in the cold call. In fact, even if you're about to close successfully on an appointment, asking the prospect to take a concrete step is still a good idea. Considering all the value you've just built with your questions, it would be a shame if you didn't get more than just an appointment for your efforts. Think of it this way. You've just painted a picture in the prospect's minds of how all these horrible problems are going to disappear and how life is going to be so great if they end up buying your solution. In fact, you even showed them that they might get a $2 million return on an investment of $2,000, an unseemly ROI. So what's wrong with asking for proof that they're serious? After all, you're about to send a sales rep out on the call, maybe on an airplane. Considering the potential benefit that the prospect might get and the cost of sending someone out on the call, don't you think the prospect ought to have a little skin in the game? Let's agree that a little good faith gesture would be nice, something tangible so that the sales rep believes that the lead is good, otherwise he might not accept the lead. Don't you agree that on a meeting that might result in them getting a $2 million on an expense of $2,000, something more than "I'll see your guy when he gets here" would be appropriate? And so here's yet another use for the concrete step, a task that we ask the prospect to do both to prove that they're sincere, that they truly see the value, and to help move the buying process forward. Now, you don't have to be quite that hard-nosed about it, so don't lose the appointment over it, but it would be nice to show that you've moved more than the prospect's lips in order to call it a good lead. And in fact, every sales process and every purchasing process can benefit from early action by both sides. After all, isn't everyone ultimately looking for a win-win? Why does the only sacrifice the prospect has to make be the promise of some time? So here are a few other concrete steps you could consider closing on. The prospect fills out a form that more fully describes their situation or their needs or goals. The prospect invites another decision maker to the meeting. The prospect sends you information that enables the sales rep to customize his presentation. The prospect provides a spreadsheet with data on their current costs and production. The prospect takes steps to prepare the budget. The prospect sends a sample of their finished goods for you to test. There are so many different concrete steps that you could ask a prospect to do or send that would both move the process forward and prove to you that she's serious. Most will depend on your particular solution or application, but if nothing jumps out at you, make something up. If nothing else, it's a test of your sales skills, and it's much better than waiting for a no-show to tell you that you screwed up. In any event, now you can close on a concrete step instead of just the appointment as follows. You say, "It sounds like this might present you with a really nice opportunity." And she says, "I agree, and I look forward to meeting with your rep." So you look for a show of commitment and ask, "Before we take out our calendars, though, I was wondering if you might be able to invite the VP of Marketing to the meeting." She, because she is so overwhelmed at the value you can bring, says, "No problem. I'm sure he'd love to hear about this." Another option is where you might ask, "After we get a date, I was wondering if you might be able to send me some of your marketing materials so we can be a little better prepared for the meeting." To which she would likely say, "I'd be happy to. Just give me your email address and I'll have our marketing manager send it out today." Or you might use this close. "Before we get together, would it be possible for you to fill out our needs assessment form? This will enable us to customize our presentation to your specific needs and challenges." To which she's likely to say, "No problem. Send me the form and I'll fill it out in the next couple of days." If you think this can't happen, think again. If you've built that much value in the appointment, why wouldn't she fill out a form or invite a peer to the meeting if it would help make it that much more productive? And regardless of how you ask for the concrete step, don't forget to close on the appointment with an assumed close or forced choice close like this. "Great, thanks. Which is better for you, Thursday at 10 or Wednesday at 3? And she says Wednesday at 3 works. Reestablish rapport and terminate the call with, "Terrific, I'll let Jack Smith, our sales rep, know, and he'll see you Wednesday at 3. So now you can see your cold call worksheet filled in with our concrete step and your next step, which is to update your call notes and discuss the opportunity with the sales rep. As you may notice, we really didn't talk about entering any competitive information that you might have uncovered. Clearly, during a call like this, you're going to uncover the presence of an incumbent vendor or at least an in-house solution, and all needs are always in some state of fulfillment, so there will always be something you can put in that space. But unless they've told you that there's no way possible for you to get their business, the only thing you need to do is enter the information so the rep can be prepared. You really don't need to respond to it. This is because if she granted you the appointment, then there's a chance that your rep is going to be able to unhook competition. And you've done enough just by getting them in the door and getting them the information. So now that we have all our needs, consequences, costs, urgency factors, what's in it for me's and benefits, stakeholders and beneficiaries, let's look at what the business case for meeting looks like. In our conversation with the VP of Sales for a $10 million business, we discovered that they were performing 20% behind their revenue forecast year to date. They're in danger of running low on cash. They're experiencing price pressure that's 10% below their break even. Their lead generation program out of marketing is weak, producing 1% of the leads they need. Overall demand is down by 15%, and they get virtually no response from their promotion strategy. If they don't find a better way to find more sales, they're going to have to lay people off in the operations department and maybe in marketing too. On the other hand, if they had a way for their sales reps to generate more appointments and get better close rates, they could get their revenue back on track. Their promotion programs, such as their seminars and trade shows, would become more effective. They'd be able to increase their prices, and therefore their margins would go up. They could afford to do more marketing programs, restart hiring, and maybe even invest in some new product development. If you were a sales VP, would the possibility of finding a solution be worth a 20-minute meeting, even if your time was worth $500 an hour? Of course it would be, and that's the point. Asking questions that uncover needs and demonstrate the potential value of solving those problems is the only way to create a real business case for meeting. So now, all you have to do is terminate the call. The most common method for closing once the prospect has concluded that she wants to move forward with the appointment is to confirm by restating from your worksheet your understanding of her needs, problems, urgency factors, and who they impact. Confirm by restating from your worksheet your understanding of the benefits she's seeking for herself and others. Summarize the conditional decision process that sets the stage for meeting. That is, if we can show you how we can save you money, this might be something you might want to consider. Summarize the next step, both yours and hers, that is her concrete step, filling out a needs analysis, confirming the date and time of the appointment, reestablish rapport, thank the prospect for her time, and disconnect from the call. And now you're going to have a great appointment. Write up your notes and pat yourself on the back.